So as I said, Germany, curves, absolutely bonkers. This is bananas here. But what does it mean? Well, in one sense, it means what it always means. German inversion, US Treasury inversion, Canadian bond curve inversion. Right, Mike, my friend in Canada? Bond curves inverted literally means the market is expecting rates to go down. Why does the market expecting rates to go down over time? Usually that's associated with the types of conditions which we call a recession. It means some form of economic distress which leads either growth and inflation expectations to fall, which you would expect in a economic contraction, or in combination with central banks eventually realizing that situation and lowering their benchmark rates, which is where Germany is right now. Incredibly certain that rates are going to go lower, even as the ECB continues to say rates are going to go higher, just like the Fed and US Treasury. This is a global phenomenon here, which is something that really should be ringing alarm bells. This is not specifically about Germany. So I'm going to talk about a paper today that was written a few years back in 2019. The last time we had inversion mania, when the yield curve started to invert, the Treasury yield curve started to invert in 2019. This was a paper written, it's called "Is a Recession Imminent? The Signal of the Yield Curve" by a trio of researchers from the National Bank of Belgium. Gotta love the Belgians for this. And it's interesting how they begin their paper, because they begin their paper kind of the way I would, which is recognizing how most economists and central bankers, every time the yield curve inverts, they say, nah, it means nothing. Here's what they write. Experience shows that commentators tend to downplay the signals given by the yield curve. In fact, when asked the question in 2007, 2000, 1990, and on earlier occasions, most economists indicated that, quote, this time is different, meaning that this time the yield curve inversion will not be followed by recession. Yet, a recession occurred every time. And this time was not different in 2019 on both counts. In 2019, the yield curve in the US inverted. Economists said, nah, this time is different. Jay Powell said, well, maybe there's something to it, but we don't buy into that stuff. A few policymakers like Neil Kashkari said, I'm a little worried about this, but by and large, if you go back and look at all the media articles that were written, especially those taken from central bank policymakers, what they said was, yep, this time is different. Except that time wasn't different. Now, we don't know for sure in the United States because COVID came along just at that particular moment when it looked like the U.S. was going to fall into recession, but we do know about all these places around the rest of the world, including Europe, which fell into recession before we got to COVID. I already talked about recently not the Bank of Japan, but the country of Japan, which found out many years later, oh yes, our recession began in October of 2018. So there was recession throughout the global economy in 2019, and the yield curve pegged it. But the German curve hadn't been inverted in 2019, nor had it been inverted leading up to the 2011-2012 recession back then. So what is going on with specifically Germany, or yield curves in particular? Why is the signal so much stronger now? Well, now that this paper didn't go into that, we'll talk about that in a minute. What this paper focused on was how many excuses and rationalizations are offered in order to deny what is really a very clear signal of recession. As the authors recall, central banks often contribute to downplaying the signals of the yield curve. Regarding the forecast made by central banks in the yield curve, we note an interesting analogy. While central banks are sometimes compared to the Delphic oracle, the yield curve can be compared to Cassandra, the princess who was given the gift to see into the future, but was cursed to never be believed. That's exactly where we are over the last year. Remember, last March, the yield curve in the US Treasuries inverted in a very small way back in March, and Jay Powell said, nope, we don't pay attention to that. We pay attention to the near-term forward spread. Then what happened? The yield curve inversion spread down the curve. Eventually, that near-term forward spread inverted too back at the same time all of this stuff was going on in Germany. Where you see the German curve completely change its character is exactly the same moment when the near-term forward spread on the Treasury curve inverted. So the Fed said this time is different, and instead, this time doesn't appear to be different, at least in terms of curve behavior, and more curves are joining in on the same party. Now back to our Belgian paper, where our authors note some famous examples of those saying this time is different. Most famously of all, the Maestro, which I say ironically every time I use it, because that was a media construction, not any level of proficiency and knowledge. Alan Greenspan notoriously declared in 2005 before the U.S. Senate Banking Committee that, quote, the evidence very clearly indicates that the yield curve's efficiency as a forecasting tool has diminished very dramatically. Yeah, it didn't. Not to be outdone, Greenspan was joined by his immediate successor, none other than one Ben Bernanke, who in 2006 declared, quote, I would not interpret the currently very flat yield curve as indicating a significant economic slowdown to come, because it wasn't a significant economic slowdown to come. It was a nasty, nasty recession that was right around the corner, whose seeds were already being sown as Bernanke, the clueless, was talking at that moment. Now, the purpose of the paper, as I said, was to go over all of these rationalizations and excuses, or many of the mainstream ones, about why we should not pay attention to the yield curve, why people always say this time is different. And in the 2010s in particular, the era of QE, what most people say is we can't trust long-term rates because the Fed or the ECB buys those bonds and spoils the signal. In the parlance of econometrics, they mess around with term premiums. Now, I'm not going to get into term premiums here. Number one, it really is a waste of everyone's time, but occasionally we do have to go over it because term premiums is something that economists talk about. So if you want to know what they're getting wrong, you kind of have to speak their language. But we're not going to do that here. I've talked about term premiums before, and I'm absolutely sure we're going to talk about term premiums again, and I'll hold my head doing it. But essentially, term premiums are a get-out-of-jail-free card as far as economists and policymakers go, because they use term premiums to avoid having to confront uncomfortable truth. That being said, our enterprising Belgian researchers in this paper showed that whether you add term premiums or not, it doesn't seem to change the predictive power of the yield curve. Here's what they say. However, there is no decisive empirical evidence showing that the slope of the yield curve should be adjusted for the term premium. In fact, models including the term premium tend to obtain better results in forecasting recessions, although the difference compared to models excluding the term premiums is not statistically significant. So the numbers look a little bit better when you add term premiums, but we don't really know if it makes any difference or not. At least the researchers in the language of econometrics and regressions, they can't say for sure that term premiums make a difference. So if you're saying we can't rely on the slope of the yield curve to predict recessions because term premiums are very different, R star and all that stuff, what they're saying is really there's no evidence to believe that.